To proceed to introducing the speaker of the day, whose talk is in fact entitled The Scale of Urbanism. Emily Talen is a professor of urbanism at the University of Chicago, where she teaches urban design and directs the Urbanism Lab. Her research is devoted to urban design and the relationship between built environment and social equity. She is the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2014 and 15, and is a fellow of the American Institute of Certified Planners. Professor Talen has written extensively on the topics of urban design, new urbanism, and social equity. She has published over 70 peer-reviewed articles and 5 books. New Urbanism and American Planning, published by Routledge in 2005. Design for Diversity, published in 2008 by Architectural Press. Urban Design Reclaimed, published in 2009 by Routledge. And City Rules, published in 2011 by Island Press. And Neighborhood, published by Oxford University Press in 2018. Her newest book, Street Life, Urban Retail Dynamics and Prospects, co-edited with Konrad Kicker, should be coming out any day now, so do look for it in your local bookstores. In addition to her own writing, she is also co-editor of the Journal of Urbanism. Professor Talen received her PhD in urban geography from the University of California in Santa Barbara, and her master's degree in city and regional planning from the Ohio State University. Before joining the University of Chicago, she has been a faculty member in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and in the School of Geographical Sciences and Urban Planning at Arizona State University. Prior to entering academia, she also worked as a professional planner in Santa Barbara, California, and Columbus, Ohio. Finally, some of you may recall Professor Talen from her sabbatical semesters at our very own MIT Department of Urban Studies and Planning between 2013 and 2014, even though I was not in the department at the time myself. Please join me in welcoming Professor Emily Talen. I'll stop sharing my screen so you can take over from your side.
Okay, so I need to share my screen again.
Yes, please.
Okay. There we go. That working? Let's see. Okay.
Coming through.
Okay, thank you so much, Andres. It's just a pleasure to be here back in DUSP, sort of. But yeah, I want to present some research I've been doing on the scale of urbanism, which is not at all about street intersections, but that only goes to show that scale is something that can be a lot of different things. So I've become very interested in this question and trying to understand what scale actually means and what the different implications are of different levels of different kinds of scale. I think the term gets thrown around quite a bit in very descriptive ways, and there's really no common understanding of what scale is or how it should be measured. And in particular, people talk a lot about small scale and that they really like small scale, and that they contrast that with mega scale or large scale. But what does that really actually mean? How do we measure it? How do we quantify that? So I've been working on trying to understand all of these things. How can scale be defined, measured, visualized, and analyzed? And I'm going to show you where I'm at with it. It's pretty preliminary, exploratory at this point. And I do want to give a shout out to Lou Thomas, who was a postdoc of mine from MIT, who helped a lot in gathering information for this research. So one of the motivations for this work has been my interaction with a group called the Incremental Development Alliance. I don't know if you folks have heard of this, but it's a really cool group of people. And their mission is to grow the capacity of regular people to develop small buildings in their neighborhoods. They want to really train aspiring developers and build the capacity for locals to invest in their own neighborhoods. And this is, this kind of work is, you'll notice immediately, is very much connected to Jane Jacobs and what she was all about. She saw incremental and small as being very essential to good urbanism. And the thinking goes that it's at this small scale that you're creating not only better pedestrian quality, but you're nurturing social and economic interconnection and interdependence. You are nurturing what is needed for a diverse kind of urbanism. And so in turn, the thinking goes, neighborhoods that develop or redevelop on a small scale are the ones that are the most sustainable and resilient. So we have to contrast that with large scale urban development, mega projects in various forms, typically seen as being very bad for pedestrian quality, the very opposite of a, sorry, I needed to advance, the very opposite of a resilient and sustainable city. The critique extends to the question of financial scale as well. Followers of small scale development will favor gradual money, small and incremental, over the detrimental impacts of cataclysmic money, as Jacobs called it, which is often present in large scale development. So this seemed like a good topic to me to dig into because there's no common understanding of what scale is or how it might be measured and what it all means. So I decided to take a shot at it. And I came up with three research questions, 3 parts to this analysis. And that's what I'm going to very briefly show you here today. The first part is about looking at scale change over time. I wanted to know what occupied these large mega projects that we see out there in the city. What was there before them? And I wanted to kind of see if there was a way to quantify that so we might really understand the level and really the level of change that has been happening from small to large scale, because that's the way the direction goes. So for this part of the analysis, we found 31 mega project sites in the city of Chicago, and we analyzed Sanborn maps, and I'll show you a little bit about that work. For the second part of the analysis, I wanted to compare urban scale to some measure of urban quality. So I think there is kind of an assumption amongst urbanists I know anyway, that larger scale is not going to be as good for pedestrian quality, in particular for block quality, as smaller scale, but I wanted to quantify that. So is there some sort of objective measure of quality of the built environment for the pedestrian, and how could we correlate that with blocks that have very different kinds of scales? So thirdly, I wanted to correlate scale with some socioeconomic variables. Are there differences between scale and socioeconomic characteristics like income and housing value and family type? And again, I'm using the city of Chicago as a case study because why not? I live here. And there are many, many ways, as I've already mentioned, to measure scale, to get at this scale question. In this research, we mostly relied on building size and building type as determining what the scale of a block is. So in part 1 of this analysis, and sorry about this big text dump here, but this is just to show you that we looked at, these are the 31 sites that we found in the city of Chicago that were, we might consider a mega project. And we did this by talking to people, by looking at Google, imagery to just kind of determine where these mega sites were. And we also relied on TIF district financing, because if you've got a TIF district involved, it's probably a mega project of some sort. So through this combination of talking to people and visual scanning and looking at the TIF data, we came up with these 31 sites. And to analyze what was on these sites before, we looked at Sanborn maps, as I've mentioned, and many of you might know about Sanborn maps. They provide information on building footprint and number of stories and land use. And so they're a really essential ingredient to analyzing urban fabric change over time. The downside of these is that they are not geolocated. They are scanned and you can look at them online, but they're not something you can pull into a GIS as a layer, at least not in the city of Chicago. I think New York did a bit of this, but I don't think that, I think this is something that needs to happen for the world. And maybe when I retire, I will spend my days digitizing Sanborn maps. Who knows? But they're in Chicago. These Sanborn maps are in 60 different volumes that one has to hunt through to find a particular place. They were periodically updated, which is good, but they can't provide a snapshot of the entire city in any one given year. So there was some complexity involved in tracking all of this down. But that's exactly what we did. And this was a matter of finding those mega development sites, contrasting them, finding the Sanborn map data that was available for those sites, and then creating a GIS layer of those two sites. And that was kind of a simple one. It got more complex as we got bigger sites that we were looking at. It's, piecing together all the Sanborn maps. I know I'm whining, but it was a lot of work. And then, creating a GIS layer of this change in scale over time. Here's the third one that I wanted to show you. So what does this all mean in the end? Well, I'm just going to show you but one table of information that we collected. So there are almost 5 times as many buildings on these 31 sites. There were 5 times as many buildings as what's there now, which supports the impression that these areas likely contained a much more vibrant mix of people and activities historically. I do think it's interesting that the number of housing units is fairly similar, comparing the 2 time periods, roughly 100 years apart. And thus the argument that large scale development is needed to increase the housing supply wouldn't really hold in this case, at least not with our particular sample of sites. So for the second part of the analysis, we wanted to know whether there's a quantifiable difference between large and small scale urbanism in terms of objective measures of urban quality. So we need to have some kind of typology of urban scale and then some kind of block rating system so we could compare the two. And we categorized the scale of all blocks in the city and then compared those measures to block quality using analysis of variance. The scale that we came up with, it turns out that attaching a scale variable to a block is pretty complicated. How are you going to find medians for, vastly different building sizes and types occupying a single block? But we, one thing we did is, I'm not going to show you the results of this, but we talked to a lot of people, and we interviewed developers and city officials and some financial folks, and tried to get their understanding of scale. And by the way, they were all over the map. I'm just showing you a little sample of the various definitions of just something like small scale. And, it was, there was absolutely no consensus. But anyway, getting back to the scale typology, the scale typology we came up with numbering 1 to 5. And this was used to calculate the mean scale of a block. And that's what we did. So what does all of this look like? Well, I'm just giving you kind of I simply looked at our variables in GIS and brought them into Google and was hunting around for a good representation of these different scaled blocks. And these are 2 through 5. Scale number 1, as you can imagine, is mostly single family housing. So I figured you didn't need an image of that. And this is how the distribution of these different scales maps out across the city of Chicago. And this is the percentage of a given scale in a particular percent of scale in the block. So in terms of comparing then that scale to some kind of measure of pedestrian quality, I relied on some other work I'd done with on just looking at block quality in Chicago and how to measure that. We had a daily life score that was about what kind of uses were available on that block. And by the way, this scoring of the block for these variables relied a lot on a lot of different variables from the city of Chicago, but also the business license data that the city of Chicago has to try to understand these patterns of uses. So mixed use was about mixed primary uses in a good Jane Jacobs kind of way. We looked at sources of employment on the block, for example, and then block character is based on a combination of block size and the presence of historic buildings. This variable called degrading factors, which seems to cover an awful lot of Chicago, is based on things like block length and whether or not there are vacant lots and whether or not there's a sidewalk, things like that. So here's the upshot of all of this. This was the analysis of variance that we did with all of this. So for these block quality measures of mixed use and daily life and degrading factors, basically the story is, I mean, I'm boiling down a lot of complexity, but this is the bottom line. That percent of scale number 1 in the block, that was lower in this analysis of variance, and all other scales were higher. But for block character, which was that measure having to do with more pedestrian quality of the block, it was scale 2 that really stood out in the analysis. It was higher. The percentage of scale 2 was higher the more you had, more pedestrian kind of block character, and all other scales had an inverse relationship or had no particular difference. And again, that scale number 2 is really that 2 to 4 unit structure kind of urbanism. Maybe it's the missing middle housing in many cases. So thirdly was, in the third part of the analysis was that tract level analysis, where we used that same scale typology and we correlated with tract level census variables. So the dependent variable here is the census tract data, and we selected variables that might reasonably be connected with scale, things like population density and income level and housing value and migration. And here's the upshot of, again, just boiling it all down. For scale number 2, it really stood out. This is the lower end of that missing middle housing. This is a very representative photo of what that looks like. Every variable was significant for scale number 2, and it was the only scale at which there was a positive association with median housing value. On the negative side, it was inversely and significantly correlated with income diversity and percent living in the same house 5 years earlier. So there's a bit of turnover associated. So the picture that emerges is that scale 2 with its dense historic fabric, unit diversity, smaller scale texture is also the scale associated with higher income and higher value, sort of the classic walkable gentrifying neighborhood in Chicago. Perhaps not that surprising. But coincidentally, In fact, in terms of housing, this is the very scale that is most threatened in Chicago. Over the past decade, Chicago has seen a dramatic loss of its scale number 2, its 2 to 4 unit housing stock. So what about the larger scales? At the largest scale, scale number 5, also, it had some interesting associations. Like scale number 2, scale 5 has a positive linear association with density and income, a negative association with percent living in the same house in the previous year. But unlike scale number 2, the association with unit type diversity is negative. And maybe that shows that larger scale contexts tend to be more monolithic, and that might be one conclusion to make. And unlike scale 2, there's no association with median value or percent rental or income diversity or building age. So those are some other associations worth thinking about and exploring. So summing up, I feel like I've just really scratched the surface here. I think that one thing that is very much needed is some kind of sensitivity analysis. We made a lot of value judgments and assumptions about things in terms of defining and measuring scale, and these need to be tested for their durability. And I would like to see more research on the role of the associations between scale and things like livability and affordability, for that matter, social diversity. And what's the relationship between scale and community cohesion and support for small business and neighborhood investment? I think these are all still pretty much open questions. I think we have a lot of theory out there about what we think is happening, but I think it would be really good to have hard data to back up those kinds of assumptions. A better awareness of these relationships and these phenomena, I think, would help residents and designers and planners understand the impact of scale changes. And so, when I see, I am on a feed from the city of Chicago, and just this morning, I got a list of all the new approved projects in the city, and they're huge. They're huge projects, and that they would be scale 5. And I rarely see the small scale kind of development. I know it's happening, but I would like to see more research tracking that small scale development and its impacts and its implications. So I have my email there. I very much welcome your feedback. Again, this is an ongoing kind of research project. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this stimulating take on scale in urban design. I'd like to just start off the conversation by looking at this also slightly from an urban economic lens, and sort of, if we think about it in an historic trajectory, then there seems to be an almost direct correlation between access to capital in real estate development and scale of urban development. If you sort of look at historically how developers have gained greater levels of access to capital, projects have gotten bigger and bigger, and they keep getting bigger every decade. So that also signals some level of inevitability that, when land values are high and access to development capital in reach, redevelopment will occur. Yet in some newly developed large projects, we see more successful examples of actually handling at least the ground plane that surrounds new urban redevelopment projects in better scale from a kind of pedestrian perspective. Cities like Vancouver would have pretty stringent regulations on what you can do even on a high-rise building with a podium block on the ground, or New York or Singapore. And can you talk a little bit about what your thoughts are on, if we take the sort of redevelopment question out of here and say, well, can we learn something from this research for large redevelopment projects? What sorts of urban design guidelines or regulations you think ought to be considered to arrive at a scale, at least on the ground level, that you think works for achieving some of these qualities for pedestrians?
Yeah, I think it's actually kind of hard to separate these things. I mean, you could have, the Vancouver model and, have this, it looks like it's small scale development on the ground plane, but actually there's big money involved. I think that really is missing but you're right, that could be much better for pedestrian quality. I think that Chicago large scale development has not had that nuance of having a more varied, frontage on the street level to simulate, I guess, small scale development and at least make it better pedestrian quality. But you're really, when you look at it that way, you're really missing that whole piece about the small scale interdependency of different ownership, diversity of ownership. The classic Jane Jacobs kind of stuff, which I think is what that Incremental Development Alliance is really trying so hard to do, is to enable those small scale developers. And the other thing I'll say is that the large format buildings, even if they are formatted in a way that looks small scale, those are not really going to do much for some of the poor neighborhoods in Chicago, where you need that kind of bottom up small scale developer to be enabled. And you're right, they don't have access to capital. Huge problem.
Yeah, I think this actually speaks very directly to one of the fundamental dilemmas in urbanism, which is that, it's weighing the environmental quality of neighborhoods that have developed historically and achieved a very complex urban tissue that is highly attractive to all of us versus the kind of pressures to redevelop. In Boston, we are very lucky to have neighborhoods like Beacon Hill or Back Bay, but folks who have looked at this from a sort of development perspective also see that the kind of market optimal FAR for places like Beacon Hill would be 10 times higher than what it is because of the land values, or much of Los Angeles is really scaled down. Much of the west side of Los Angeles, for instance, Santa Monica, and most of the city that spills towards the ocean. And as a result of that, the city has been forced to expand outward. And this sort of speaks to a certain trade-off we always face in urbanism too, of the sort of preservation value of great historic neighborhoods. But if density is kept out, then it means that growth has to occur laterally somewhere else. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? Like, what are your thoughts on that? Because that's an unresolvable issue so often.
Yeah, I don't know. That's really a tough one. I think, well, one thing I'll say on the density front, I think this idea that larger scale and mega format is required for density, I'm not sure that that's necessarily the case. I mean, it wasn't the case in the analysis we did of the 31 sites. So that's one thing. I mean, you can get density in there in much smaller scales. But yeah, I don't know if that's answering your question. I don't know what the situation is. LA always seems like such a disaster to me, scale wise. I don't even know what to do with it.
Right. Well, let's open it up. Ari, I'll hand it over to you, see what questions are coming up from the chat.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Professor Talen, for this wonderful presentation. Your work, as you know, has inspired so much of mine. So I just wanted to underscore how lucky we are to have you with us today. So maybe I'll start with a couple of questions about urban design. And specifically also linking to a little bit of what you were talking with Andres about density. So people were wondering whether you can talk a little bit more about the differences between FAR and scale. And specifically whether you might have missed or maybe revealed sort of new things by looking at scale instead of FAR.
Yeah, we didn't really look at, in this particular measure with the data I showed you, we weren't so concerned with FAR because we had to streamline it. I mean, it does get incredibly complex. We were looking at variables like building height and square footage. I don't know that FAR is really going to give you anything better in terms of how the building sits on the block, which is really an important variable too, looking at setbacks. And actually that was one variable we used to determine whether it was in the scale 1. We looked at housing units and whether or not they were attached. And if they weren't, then we put them into scale 1. So yeah, there was just, it turned out to be, once you get into the weeds on what buildings to include at what scale and how to do this, it really does get pretty complicated.
Thanks. Yeah, maybe related to this last point that you were mentioning about how the buildings connect to the street, that actually came up in the Q&A as well. So maybe you can speak a little bit more about that connection between big buildings and the street, which is critical to define the scale, and whether you also considered other sort of urban indicators of this same flavor.
Well, that's what we were trying to get at with the those block quality measures. And I think that they did capture that there was, you know, the larger scale buildings were having, you know, suffering with their block quality to some degree. There, you know, if the block had, we looked at presence of sidewalks, presence of vacant land, presence of uses that would be considered a little less pedestrian friendly, like auto dealerships, and whether there's parking lot in front. We tried to capture that. And those, you know, it bore out that was an association with the larger scale buildings. So I think there is information in this particular analysis that would help anyone who's trying to make the argument that smaller scale is better for walkable urbanism than larger scale. I mean, you know, ultimately that's kind of where we were going with all this, to be honest. But and I think that bore out to some degree. But as I mentioned, it needs a sensitivity analysis, because I think it could be attacked, you know, with people saying, well, what if you measured it this way? You know, would these associations still hold up? So it's really kind of about verifying what I think we intuitively think is true about large scale versus small scale urbanism. I don't know. I mean, Andreas was bringing up the point about what if it's a smaller scale looking building, but it's still big money and it's a mega project. You know, what's that going to do for block character? And we didn't nuance it that way, but I think that would be important, because we were just looking at those TIF districts, and they weren't, I mean, mostly the TIF districts, and those are, you know, all of one source of money, mostly. You know, it's a lot of public funding.
I see. Thank you. So maybe an additional question about the analysis, which I think you didn't really show where these projects were located. So maybe you can speak a little bit about their location. And one thing that occurred to me is that maybe these projects prior to being developed were already like in different trajectories, socially and demographically. So maybe you can also speak whether you've also considered maybe like controlling or accounting for some of these trajectories prior to when these developments were done.
Well, I do have a map of the locations, which I should have included, but they're kind of all over. Okay. But they are, you know, a lot of them are sort of classic urban renewal sites, which now have hospitals and universities on them. And some of them, it is true that some of them were already on land 100 years ago that was occupied by railroads and things like that. So you know, it wasn't all going from that small scale to the large scale fabric. So it might be a good idea to kind of separate those things out in terms of really understanding what was the sites that had that small scale complex urbanism before versus sites that didn't. I think that would not be a bad idea.
Thanks. Maybe I'll ask Brent, who has a question. Brent, can you unmute yourself?
Yep, happy to unmute, and sorry, apologize, but I'm driving, so I'll just leave my phone, my camera off if that's okay. Otherwise you get an unflattering view of my nose as I'm turning corners and stuff. Emily, thank you for this work, and I think it's great to have scale enumerated more carefully, and also to have scale associated with urban values more carefully. And I think this work makes a lot of contributions. And I'm interested in you reflecting on the causes of this problem in scale. Now, we know with Jacobs was decrying state intervention essentially in the city as a kind of a left libertarian with her call against urban renewal. And obviously urban renewal caused some of these problems of these giant scale parcels in cities that as a result have generated pretty terrible developments. In Chicago is certainly no exception, with many terrible parcels generated by urban renewal. But I'm interested in your reflections on other causes of this of these large scale projects, because it seems to some extent that other people like Ron Koolhaas, who may not be your favorite urban designer, but he's argued that this is a natural outcome of the way cities are built and cities are expanded. But I'm just wondering if you have any reflections on cause, and therefore any reflections on what we as urban designers can actually do about this trend toward these poor quality large scale developments.
Okay, yeah, thanks for your question. Nice to hear from you, Brent. Yeah, I think all the inertia is actually toward the big players, the big money. This is something we've known for a long time. I mean, Jacobs was talking about it in the 60s, and Marshall Berman had wonderful writing about all of the big money coming together, big players. I mean, when we did these interviews of these developers, some of the main players in development in the city of Chicago were just completely enamored with the idea of putting a big project together. I mean, it's fun for them. For some people, it's a power play, and so all the inertia is there. And a lot of times there's an enabling going on from the city of Chicago, with the TIF money being dangled in their face, and banks are certainly pushing that larger scale as well, sometimes, because it's about turning making bigger profits, bigger project, bigger profits. All of this is to say that I think that planners, I do wish that there was a concerted effort to offer more of a level playing field for the small scale developers, the ones that are not in that game, that don't have the resources to override regulatory problems. For example, when we did our interviews of small scale developers, a lot of them mentioned that they just, it often, whether you do a 10-unit project or a 300-unit project, it doesn't matter, because it's still the same amount of resources needed to fight the whatever legal battles are there, or the regulatory changes that need reforms that need to be overcome. So that's an incentive to go bigger and bigger if it's all the same kind of cost. The small scale developers don't have that kind of flexibility. They can't even afford to fight the 10-unit requirements that are needed. So I think that there are some things planners can do to try to help those incremental development folks. And part of it is just getting them connected, getting them, giving them some resources so that they can talk to each other more. They often don't even know, in a big city like Chicago, there might be these individual efforts, and there could be a collaboration that would really help, and a pooling of resources, and sharing contractors, and just kind of upping that whole knowledge base that's needed for getting small scale development going. Of course, getting some financial capital in there would be wonderful too, but I'm just talking, being really realistic here about the limits of that kind of approach. But yeah, so there's definitely things planners could do in a more proactive way.
Thanks, Emily. Those are very thoughtful ideas, and I agree with you 100%. Thank you very much.
Sure, thanks.
Thank you, Brent. So next we'll have a question about sort of the financial conditions that will enable the level 2. Kay, can I ask you to unmute yourself?
Yes, I have. Thanks. Thanks for your talk. When I look at the picture you just showed, level scale 2 is the perfect example of small scale investment in the whatever 1900s or 1920s. Small capital being invested in one clump. And today, I don't know how many people would be willing to do that, to have all of their retirement funding in one building. In particular, as certainly from a European point of view, managing the property, having the hassle with the tenants would just not be feasible. So the question becomes, what do we need to do on the legal front to allow owners of small amounts of capital to build these houses and to maintain them and then to earn their pension from them?
Well, I would just direct you to the Incremental Development Alliance that has really been thinking through these kinds of questions. How can we make it a profitable venture? I think you do. This makes me a little nervous, but it does have to be a mission-driven developer. You know, it has to be somebody who's got their heart in it, and you know, helping with securing some financing. That is something actually the planners or city officials could help with, because right now, what we heard from talking to small scale developers is you walk into a bank and they don't even want to touch you if it's under 10 million. And so we need to find ways to, you know, get the lenders to have the security to lend for these smaller scale projects. And there are things that can be done. It's just a matter of scaling up those smaller scale kind of ventures. And it's so needed. It's so needed. It just breaks my heart for poor areas in my city that are just waiting around for the big player to come to town, for the big Whole Foods or big box to swoop in and put in a mega project. And, you know, that's going to be the answer to their woes. Well, what we've seen time and time again is the big player comes in, the city enables it through a TIF district, and then they don't last. And then they leave after 5 years. And then that community is stuck with this big box or this big development that crashed. So if you can enable those smaller scale developers who are rooted in the community and have more of a sense of ownership of that small scale. Maybe it's a question of getting the players that be the city officials, the planners, whoever, the lenders, to understand how much benefit there is to, you know, citywide, to enabling and doing some effort to help these small scale developers get going.
But you assume it's a professional. It's not, because if you look at these buildings, those were private persons who just built for their retirement a house and rented it out.
Oh, I see.
So this is the ultimate small scale developer. But from what you said, you're thinking about professionals. Is that necessary? Because the planning processes have become so complicated and the laws to set up the tenement contracts, the rental contracts have become so complex. So what could it be that all what we have perceived as progress in the law has made all of this development impossible?
No, it doesn't have to be professionals. It's regular old folks. It's folks that have no background in development at all. I mean, that's the target of the groups that I have been having conversations with, for sure.
Okay, good to know. Thanks.
Thank you. I think, Emily, do we have a couple more minutes or?
We have time for one more question. I got to run another class.
I know. So maybe in the couple minutes that we have left, there's been a question by Ryan. Ryan, Could you unmute yourself?
Yep.
Thank you.
Hi, Emily. Ryan here in Tucson.
Hi, Ryan.
Hi. I was wondering if you're, well, one, do you have a paper on this? Because I'd be curious to see what methods you used for this study so that they could be replicated locally. And
I
then,
do. I do have a paper. I'll send it to you.
okay, great. The other thing is, I've left a few different case studies in the chat. There's one that Neil Heller put up on Public Square for South Bend, Indiana, and then one that Bevan and Liberatos did in Charleston, large scale versus small scale. And then the last one was one in Seattle done by Jonathan Conkle for his master's thesis. I don't know if you're familiar with this paper. It's called Urban Grain. And I think that it's maybe like a different name to the same idea of like scale is the thing of the question of granularity. And so he's talking about, consolidation versus parcelization. Parcelization is basically creating more small parcels to enable the small scale developers and what role the city plays in it. So kind of like different methods for developing this stuff, but I think I'm just curious whether or not you included that in your background research.
I think that might very well be in our very extended literature review. You can take a look, but no, I'm kidding, because there actually isn't that much literature on this. There's a lot of literature on mega projects and why we hate them. And but and so that's wonderful news, but it only goes so far. So really tracking all the benefits of the smaller scale, there isn't quite as much, and doing things like what you're talking about. I haven't seen a lot of empirical data on that.
Thank you. Thank you, Emily, and for all the questions from the audience and participants. We do need to wrap up because Emily needs to teach a class. And I want to just do another round of applause and thanks for your great presentation today. Great to have you back in the department, even virtually. And I wanted to shout out for next Monday, we will have Catherine Firth, who's head of urban design at Arup, based in London, joining us at 12:30. So please tune back in next Monday at 12:30. And Emily, thank you so much. We don't want to hold you longer from your students.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure. And a quick question. I'm just looking at the chat and there's all kinds of really great comments in here.
We will share the chat with you.
You'll share those?
It.
Oh, good.
Yes.
Yes.
Excellent. Excellent.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Emily.
Bye. Thanks.